Carissa here from the Mono County Libraries, also known as that lady from the library, here to present to you a new project specifically for you. Evolution of Storytelling Project. First up, spoken stories.
Human interaction is based on storytelling. It's literally how humans make sense of the world around them. I'm really excited that you're taking an interest in the Evolution of Storytelling project. Storytelling is a very unique human experience. Actually, I like to think of it as our superpower. Both individuals and societies rise and fall based on their ability to tell a convincing story. In this first session, we'll be looking at a few things. First up, the importance of storytelling and why you should care about it. Secondly, we'll have a look at the ESP, a short project overview, including where to find upcoming workshops and explore how teens across the country are sharing their voices. And thirdly, we're going to look at spoken stories now and then, which is more or less a historical crash course in the evolution of storytelling, how human stories have developed over time. Throughout this session, there's also going to be some interactive challenges for you to participate in, so stay tuned. Storytelling is uniquely human because of our capacity to imagine. We can imagine things that aren't directly in front of us, and we can relate to things that aren't necessarily directly in our bubble. So here's your first challenge. You're going to choose one of the above animals and introduce yourself. Tell us about your day. I recognize that I'm not going to be able to hear it. You're more than welcome to send it to me. But the idea is for you to recognize the way that we relate to different things in the world, be it an animal or an object. Through storytelling, we connect. So here's your challenge. Choose one of these animals, talk about how your day started, and tell it in the third person. You've got an example coming up.
So, Carissa, the brown bear, woke up and crawled out of her den this morning to see the skies were clouded over with smoke, which didn't make her very happy because she's an asthmatic bear and she gets a little bit alarmed when she sees smoke lingering in the skies. But she knows not to let that bring her down too much. She's a very fortunate bear, actually. She's meandered the woods quite a bit and has met bears from many other parts and knows that as a California bear, she's got it pretty good with blue skies and lots of sunshine. So she tries not to dwell on that too badly. And this bear, she's something. She really cares a lot about the cub bears because she believes in them and wants to see them grow into the best bears they can and embrace whatever gifts and talents that they have and feel fully confident in themselves and really just go out there and get it. So she really tries to keep a positive, upbeat attitude, especially for all the cubs out there that she cares about. She doesn't like how the older generations mock all of the younger bears.
Like, they just go digging in the dumpsters. They don't even know how to catch a fish.
It just doesn't seem right. They didn't choose to grow up on the outskirts of resort towns and be confined or rather tempted by all of that delicious trash. But she wants to show them it's okay. You can make the best of human trash and still learn how to hunt and be the best bear you can be. And she's convinced that that's very possible because otherwise, why would humans always say, grin and bear it?
Stories allow humans to step outside of themselves, which ultimately allows us to understand ourselves from different perspectives. This impacts the story that we have of ourselves and tell ourselves, which in turn affects how we go through life. It affects how you introduce yourself to other people. It affects what jobs you might apply to, how you interview for that job. Sometimes this is referred to as social and emotional learning skills, and this is going to come up shortly. Part of the aim of the Evolution of Storytelling project is to improve our self skills, what we take on as projects, what we want to finish, our self awareness, so that we know what we're good at, what we're not good at, and feel okay with that, as well as how we relate to others, which includes controlling our emotions and cooperating with others to build relationships, which is the basis for community. By the end of today's session, you'll be presented with a menu board to choose a project that falls within the spoken story category and start to develop a story of your own. The Evolution of Storytelling project is set up in such a way so that it runs along with your school year. We have 5 different mediums that we're looking at, each of which we'll look at for 2 months. And we basically just trace it through its evolutionary process. So humans started telling stories by speaking. So we're going to start with spoken stories in September and October. We'll move into illustrated stories in November and December, illustrations only, no words allowed. We didn't have actual written language until 3500 BC. So by the time we get to January, we'll dive into written stories. We'll start with personal stories, move into social stories, social topics. And then finally, at the end of the school year, we'll be caught up to one of our modern forms of storytelling, which is digital. So you'll have a chance to learn some skills in animation, stop motion photography, things like this. Then in the summer, we'll have an open storytelling contest, which you will all be invited to participate in. No pressure. But you may submit at that point a story of your choice in any medium that you'd like. And then we kickstart it all over again with the start of the next school year in September 2021. So if you'd like to get to the details of the Evolution of Storytelling project, because it is a large project, so I needed to put it on a website because I can't keep all those details in my head all the time. This is the Mono County Library website, so you'll want to come here first. Then you're going to click on Programs in the top menu bar. It's going to open up a drop-down menu for you. And come on down to the Evolution of Storytelling project for teens. And now we're on the ESP website. So you'll see over here we have a few different sections. You can always click on register to jump back up here and register for free. That comes straight to me, and I'll reach out and touch base with you and let you know what's happening next. When you scroll down, you'll get an overview of the importance of storytelling, more or less everything I've rattled off to you so far in this session. The timeline, which we just went over, as well as a note on the delivery. We weren't going to do this virtual until COVID happened, so just a brief note on that. And here's where you get an overview of the different mediums that we're looking at. So
Medium? I wanted a large, not a medium.
So medium being a way in which we communicate with somebody. So that word media, mass media, means that we have channels of communication to connect with the masses. Media being plural for medium. So you can find out a little bit more about each of these mediums right here. And then beneath that is where you'll find the detailed overview of our schedule. So far, we just have spoken stories teased out because it's the one that we're dealing with at present. So you can see my session scheduled here for the 7th. Sophia Flores from the Mono County Behavioral Health will be delivering the second workshop on the 21st of September. That's once again a Monday from about 3:30 to 5. So you guys won't want to miss that one. And then we have a local actress, Marcy Murray, delivering Speak the Speech, Elocution, Diction, and Projection, learning how to use that voice. We have another workshop scheduled for you on the 19th. Conversations are still happening to finalize that one. And then finally, we'll have an optional sharing session for anyone that would like to share what they've been working on. We're moving into illustrated stories in November and December. That will be mostly led by Lori Michelin, the Makerspace coordinator at the library and a super well-respected local artist. You guys won't want to miss those sessions. Those will be really fun. I've seen what she's cooking up. And we'll continue to upload more details for you here. So this is always your home base to find out what's going on in the ESP and if you're interested in an upcoming workshop. Remember, you don't have to be there for every one. If you're just interested in one, totally okay. So this is where you can find out what's going on. And actually, the thing I'm going to ask you to do next, you're going to access through this Explore More section. So this section of the website contains a few examples of really powerful stories from people your age. So we have Brave New Voices up here. If you guys haven't seen spoken word yet, I encourage you to check it out. It should give you that inspiration you need to jump into Sophia's workshop. We have an example of a digital story here taken from a StoryCorps story, so super sweet. We'll be getting into this later in the year. And this is actually a story I'd like you to watch now. It's an example of a very modern spoken story. It might not come across like a poetry slam or some story you might expect to hear around a campfire, but it's very fitting to the types of stories that we tell every day. So this is coming from The Moth, which is based out of New York, which has brought to life what we call the story slam. So it's all about being so comfortable with your story that you can get up on stage and tell a 5 to 10 minute story with powerful delivery. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to jump onto the Evolution of Storytelling Project website and go ahead and hit play. Listen to Christian's story. And while you're watching it, think about or note down whatever's most comfortable for you. Just think about what you learned from this story. It can be about life in general. It can be about childhood. It can be about Christian. But I want you to be thinking about, what am I getting out of this story? So one of the most beautiful things about stories is that each listener, reader, viewer receives the story in a different way, and we all walk away with what we need at that time. So maybe you can think about a movie that you saw when you were younger, and maybe you even really enjoyed it, but you didn't understand certain parts that you might have understood differently as you grew older. And that's the way we always interact with stories. You take away from it what you're ready to receive. So I asked you to listen for what you were learning from Christian stories so that we could each let each other know what we were getting from the story and see how many lessons that there were, in fact, in his 6 minute story. So this is a Padlet wall where we can each post a comment anonymously. I posted this one. You can see my name and profile down here if I add a comment, but otherwise the post itself is anonymous. So I noted that Christian's funny and he knows it. He adds pauses in there because he knows people want some time to react. It's not awkward and rushed. So that's the thing that I took away. You can take away anything from his story, from his delivery, from something that he said that relates to you. Maybe you also like to spend a lot of money on shoes. Maybe you remember a moment in your childhood where you lied for the first time, or you were caught lying, or what have you. Just want your reaction to what resonated with you in the story. And you can add that by clicking on the link beneath this video, and then just come down here to the plus sign, and you'll be able to contribute that. So I look forward to what you have to share. As I mentioned earlier, the story that we tell ourselves about who we are is intrinsically linked with our social and emotional skills with ourself. And so I just wanted to take a moment to share with you this developmental rubric where we can check in and see how we're feeling on a particular day or particular time in our life. So we have self-awareness, which relates to confidence and being aware of our strengths and limitations. And our ways of measuring this is how often we're willing to share our work, or at least a reflection of our work, with others. We're also going to be looking at self skills, also known as self management. And here we're looking at that self-motivation that you have to finish a project that you started or to respond to others. Someone might share a story that shares a perspective that doesn't quite jive with the way you see things, but being able to listen and recognize that they're likely coming from a different angle. So having a self-controlled way to respond to that with consideration. Social awareness, we're really diving into empathy and respect here. And this is more or less about listening to others respectfully and then being able to provide some positive feedback. Hey, this resonated with me. You know what? I saw this differently. And making sure that you can communicate that effectively. And finally, social skills, tying in again to this communication capacity for communication as well as relationship building. Do you maybe have something that you can offer somebody, offer them some help, or sometimes has to do with receiving help? It really has to do with cooperation, which is at the core of storytelling too. So just so that you guys are aware, this is something that we are absolutely working toward in our storytelling endeavors. For our visual learners, we have that same social and emotional learning outcome rubric in Bitmoji style. Big thank you to the artists over there creating these Bitmojis. I feel very understood as a human, so thanks for the laughs. If you have a glance at this rubric, you can see that if you're limited in this self-awareness, self-management, social skills, you're often feeling quite awkward, bashful. You just don't really want to be there. You're not always feeling good with yourself. If you're developing, you're meh, you're there. You're not always really excited about it. You might go in and out of feeling awkward and confident, but you're trying and you believe in yourself enough to do that. When you're developed, you're feeling quite confident. You're good, even if you're not good at something. You got enough self belief to jump in there and go for it. Be able to laugh at yourself. I will add when you are developed in your self awareness and self skills, it's not a it's not like a prize that you win and you have it forever. You're constantly working on this, and you have good days and you have bad days. But I do want to make sure that you guys are aware that this is something that we're working on through storytelling because it's the foundation for how we interact with each other and how we share ourselves. So we're going to be coming back to this. I'm really excited to help you guys be more aware of this because you are especially at an age where having this awareness of yourself and how you interact with others is super essential, seeing as you're about to navigate the world on your own. So we want to make sure we equip you with the tools that you need to do this well. Why do we tell stories? Though the underlying why remains the same, the how has been affected quite a bit. In the past, before written stories were around, spoken and illustrated stories were the main mediums. How we tell spoken stories has changed a lot, and I'd like you to participate in a short exercise to better understand this. One more note. I just want you to think about the word verse, and I've included the etymology or the history of the word here for you. The word comes from Latin versus, which actually came from turning a plow. So you can think of a verse like a line of writing, like you're making turns. I'll let you dive into the activity now. I'll explain it next slide. Now I'm going to ask you guys to post a sticky note or an image from a favorite story onto a Jamboard. I don't know if you guys have used Jamboard yet. It's a new feature of Google Drive. So I'm going to post, just like I did for that Padlet link, beneath this video, you're going to see a link to the verse recall Jamboard, and then you're going to see a link to the excerpt recall Jamboard. On the verse recall, I want you to think about a verse you know. So because a lot of us don't memorize poetry anymore, I'm guessing this is going to come from a song. So you can see my example there. It's from Gloria Gaynor, I Will Survive. Anything. It can be from whatever you want, just a verse that you have memorized in your head. Second Jamboard, the excerpt, I want you to post a sticky note or a quote, or I uploaded an image here. It's from Dumb and Dumber, And it's just the big gulps, huh? Well, see you later. So just pull from any quote or excerpt that you can bring from another story and put it on that Jamboard. That's it. Now, haven't yet seen your examples of verse or an excerpt from a story that you know, but I'm guessing that the verse you were able to remember was quite a bit longer than whatever excerpt that you shared. And I wanted to share this with you because when we look into genres of oral narratives or spoken stories, you'll see that a lot of the older ones were told in verse because humans didn't yet have a written language. And so it was important to write things in verse to memorize it and pass it on. As we developed a written language, though, oral narratives shifted because they were no longer a vessel of memory. It was still an important form of storytelling, but it no longer had the purpose of being a way in which we remembered the past because the written language eventually took over this. Not too different from the fact that a lot of you take a lot less notes because you can snap a picture of your teacher's slide. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does stories promote cooperation? We're going to have a look at this by examining some genres of spoken stories. Now, I've chosen to use the phrase spoken stories, but in academic scenes, they often call them oral narratives. One example of an oral narrative is an epic or a saga. This is a long narrative in poetic verse, meaning that we have a rhyming scheme and some structured syllables that centers on retelling a historical event. It might be a catastrophic event, it might be something we're celebrating, it might be a war that was won. And this promotes cooperation in a community by remembering their shared history. It lets them be proud of where they came from and what they want to achieve. And it might make some of those young people ready to continue fighting for the land that their community sits on. Folk tales includes fables, fairy tales, proverbs. They're not really thought to be true. They're often set in a timeless and placeless setting, but they do aim to teach a lesson. Think about the Three Little Pigs. That lesson is telling us we should think ahead about the house that we want to build. We don't want to rush through it. We want a stable and secure future. And so when you hear that as a kid, you see that the only pig that came out of the situation safely was the one who took the time to build his house properly with bricks. Legends are prose narratives, meaning that they aren't written in or they aren't told in poetic verse. They're often set in the present or recent past, and they're believed to be true. For example, we have the legend of Robin Hood. There's not really much recorded about him as history. In fact, some people speculate that was done on purpose because he was a bit of a renegade and poking at organized society. But people have continued to tell his story because they think his cause was worthwhile. And so they hope to teach or inspire with his lifestyle of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. There's another legend worth noting, I think, because it has been shown to have its roots in some true history in the last century, and that is the legend of Shi Huangdi. He was said to have unified China in 200 BCE after a long period of different regions there fighting. Historians didn't know whether or not this guy actually existed. It seemed too fantastic, some of the accounts they were receiving from history. But then in the last century, we've discovered his tomb. We found these great terracotta soldiers. Maybe you've heard of them before. So, in this sense, the legend of Shi Huangdi was used not so differently from epics and sagas. It was meant to talk about a golden era in Chinese history when they had a great ruler that unified all of its people. Myths are narratives set in the distant past, and they generally explain how things came to be, how things are ordered, and how harmony can be achieved. And so this is really important because If we don't share the same goal on how harmony can be achieved, we're likely working in very different directions. And finally, personal narratives is the form that we interact with most often today. Personal narratives includes a lot. It's your version of any experiences that you've had. You might deliver it in poetry. You might just deliver it in prose. You might deliver it in song. You might call up a friend and tell them about your day. In any case, when you're sharing personal narratives, you're also trying to make sense of what your goals are. And by chatting with friends or people that we care about, we are refining who we are and what we want to work toward. So, history is a fascinating story, and it allows us to better understand where we came from and how we got here. By having some understanding of the cause and effect of history, we can make better informed decisions about how we wish to move forward. After all, as we just learned, we share stories so that we can work toward the same goals. Let's have a look at how storytelling has evolved over time as humans develop new technologies, and how these changes have impacted the ways in which we organize and govern, or cooperate. Pay attention to the shift from slow to rapid advancements that we've had in communication technologies. This is why we sometimes call our era the age of information. We might consider renaming it as the age of mass storytelling. To start, scientists point to 68,000 BCE as the approximate date that humans were able to begin thinking abstractly, or about situations not directly in front of them. Before Common Era refers to anything that happened before the year 0. I've cited Yuval Harari for this date, a renowned Israeli historian and author of the book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*. In this book, he provides an example of how this cognitive revolution made it possible for Homo sapiens, or the wise man, to cooperate so effectively that they were able to wipe out other human species like the Neanderthals. Basically, it's the difference between reacting in the moment and thinking ahead. If you're out with a band of hunters and see a bear, you'd warn your crew, "Dude, watch out, there's a bear." But Homo sapiens developed the cognitive capacity, or the brain power, to imagine the situation. So, if we encounter a bear tomorrow when we're out hunting, do we have a game plan? "If we encounter" is fictive language. It hasn't actually happened. This development gave Homo sapiens a huge advantage over other animals, as it made it possible to cooperate more effectively, eventually giving them the power to develop the entire world. Our oldest records of illustrated storytelling come from between 38,000 and 10,000 BCE. In fact, you can find local examples of this in the form of petroglyphs, or rock carvings. These illustrations show that certain figures and animals became significant in the lives of humans, so much so that humans included them in their stories. They may have been included in a myth about why the sun rises in the east, or an historical event worth remembering. Through both spoken and illustrated stories, these humans were trying to pass along the wisdom they gained to their children and grandchildren so that they might live a better life. Sound familiar? It's not until 3200 BCE that humans began writing, a few thousand years after the agricultural revolution, which occurred around 10,000 BCE. This revolution made it possible for humans to shift from hunting and gathering to farming, paving the way for civilization thanks to the food supply it provided. When you've got extra food, it's important to label it. Otherwise, you're left with that mystery meat in the freezer and aren't sure whether or not you should eat it. Seriously though, our oldest record of writing comes from clay jars that stored wine and grains, and this led to keeping track of taxes and other governmental matters. Eventually, it transitioned to a phonetically based alphabet, which made it possible for all of those spoken stories to be written down on papyrus scrolls. For example, the first 5 books of the Bible, known in Jewish tradition as the Torah, circulated as spoken stories for many, many years before they were finally written down. If you read Exodus carefully, you'll see that some verses are repetitive as they merge together various versions of the spoken narrative. At this point, it's worth noting that new technologies, even reading and writing, always has its critics. This might be hard to imagine living in a society that depends on a population that can read and write, but Socrates, a very well-known philosopher of ancient Greece, was alarmed that this new technology would dumb down the youth. Does this sound familiar? Now we're going to go ahead and jump into the Common Era, which we label as starting with year 0. There's a pretty long gap during which time storytelling doesn't really change a whole lot. That's not to say there were not other significant happenings during this time, but stories were mostly shared in the traditional oral or spoken medium, as most people couldn't yet read or write. Literacy, the ability to read or write, was limited to the nobles and the church in Europe, or those in power. Most of the population in Europe at this time were peasants or farmers. And while they were certainly entertained by spoken stories, reading and writing was limited simply to the powerful who had the privilege of being educated. Then we have a massive turning point. In 1455, the technology to print with movable type, meaning individual letters could be removed or moved around, comes to Europe from China, and Mr. Gutenberg prints the first codex, or book. Any guesses as to what the first printed book was? If you thought or said Bible, you are correct. Before this, all books were handwritten, which takes a lot of time. Catholic monks wrote and rewrote the Bible many times, and they even decorated it with illustrations called illuminations. That said, due to the time-consuming process and the fact that most peasants were concerned about having enough food to survive the winter, there wasn't much of a variety of books to print. The printing press would change this forever. In fact, it was so pivotal in the way that humans encountered stories that it led to a 30 years war in Europe. Thanks to the printing press, critics of the Catholic Church and their complete power to interpret the Bible was questioned by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, who could now share their views with other communities across the European continent. The power of the Catholic Church was now challenged. After years of warfare, the European map was remade according to Catholic and Protestant regions. Now we jump forward another 400 years. As you may or may not know from history class, a lot happened in this time. There was a lot of colonization, some big revolutions, including the Industrial Revolution, which paved the way for urbanization, or the movement of people from the farming field and the countryside to the factories in the cities. This, in turn, eventually makes mass education possible, which leads to increased literacy rates. More printed materials circulate, like newspapers and pamphlets, and then in 1832, the first form of telecommunication is developed. Tele is Latin for distant, and graph is Latin for writing. So it literally translates to distance writing. With telegraphs, humans could share their stories instantaneously, even to faraway places. It's not long before this technology evolves to include more modern forms of spoken stories, like the telephone in 1874, the radio in the early 20th century, and the TV in the 1950s. The rest of the story will likely be more familiar to you. The telephone becomes more convenient in the 1980s when cell phones, the first generation of cell phones, entered the scene. With the advent of the personal computer and the internet in the 1980s, many previous communication streams become digital, which has both enhanced and expanded the telecommunication technologies of the 19th and 20th centuries. As each of these new storytelling capacities came out, those in power took care to regulate the way in which they were used. not so different from the legal cases we see today with companies like Facebook and Google. If I weren't afraid of losing your attention, since this is quite a long historical overview, I'd provide you with many more examples of how these developments affected those in power, like how the Nazis in Germany distributed free radios in the 1930s to get the population on board with its horrific goals. In a word, as a storytelling as storytelling technologies have developed so rapidly in the past 200 years as compared to the rest of human history, we're living in a pivotal time in history once again. And it's up to us to create and share the stories that will lead to human cooperation. It's a big task, I know. But as you can see, we've been doing this for a very long time. So I invite you to join this human adventure and tell your story. And finally, here we are, that spoken stories menu I told you we would wrap up today's session with. So now that you have a bit of a taste for what's happening now with the likes of Christian Garland and his story slam at the Moth, and a glimpse back in history, how we got from sharing all of our stories in a spoken format to the technologies that have allowed this telling of stories to shift, and the mediums by which we do share them with one another. Your challenge now is to craft a story that you'll deliver in a spoken manner. You might write to prepare the piece. It's a tool that we have now, so why not use it? But ultimately, whatever you work on, you during this part of the project, you would want to prepare it to deliver in an oral fashion. So you have a few options. You can write out a poem that you plan to deliver out loud. You'll get help with this in the next 2 workshops. Sophia will be doing a session on spoken word, and after that, Marcy will be talking with us about diction. So both of those workshops will help you to continue to craft a poetry slam piece if you're into that. You can stick strictly to music and write a verse or a chorus for a song. You could dive into that more personal experience in your life and prepare a story slam similar to what Christian did. Or if you don't want to share something from your personal experience, you can write out some interview questions for a family member that prompts them to tell their story and make a recording of this. If you want to dive into the folk tales genre, you could come up with a story that you'd like to share with your younger self, or maybe a younger brother, sister, or cousin. You could include in this story a lesson that you think would be good for them to know at their age that they can keep with them. You can consider one of your favorite folk tales from when you were a child and rewrite it in some way. Maybe give it a different ending or modernize it. You might consider one of the changes made to a folk tale and see how it's been shifted. I know a lot of those Disney movies come from folk tales and were drastically changed from their original stories, so it might be fun looking at something like that. Or you might dive into legends and myths. Let's see, you can choose a legend grounded in history and investigate its historical roots. Or you could come up with a fun local legend to start sharing with your friends. And if you want to dive into sort of myth-based writing, the easiest way to get into this one, I would say, is to think of an origin story or a story that might explain the way things are. Granted, science might offer another story or explanation for why this is, but it doesn't mean you can't have fun with it in a story. So it could be as simple as, why is the grass green, or what is lightning? And you can write your own explanation for why this is. This document is available for you as a PDF beneath this video. So if you want to print it out and have a look at it that way. Otherwise, it's your final challenge. Get started on a project of your own, and we will hopefully see you for Sophia's workshop on the 21st, The Power of Spoken Word. Take care, and hope to see you then.